Hi, I'm Ed Rosney. I'm an APIC member of the Oregon chapter, and I'm here in Hillsboro, Oregon at the Democratic Party office. I was invited by Carl Fisher to do a display of some of my memorabilia related to the civil rights movement as a tribute to Dr. King Jr. Day. And what I brought along was a mix of items. I think one of the good things about collecting is it can be more than buttons. So on the theme of civil rights, one of the things I brought along was some stereo views that show African American folks doing manual labor, some folks working the cotton field in the South, and some folks working in the turpentine industry in Georgia. Um, also, I also collect books from the Federal Writers Project, which was during the New Deal, the WPA. In addition to building roads and such, they also hired writers who were out of work. They're known for the WPA guides, which were guides of the various states, but they also did books on folklore. And the great book here, this is one of the real rare WPA books, The Negro in Virginia, developed by the Hampton Institute. It's just fascinating reading. It's written in 1940. The authors were in the midst of still really severe segregation, but they're telling the story here about from 1619 until 1940, what life was like for African Americans in Virginia. Just a really great book. WPA also interviewed former slaves or the families of former slaves, the descendants, and some of those interviews simply got archived and sat in libraries for a lot of years. This is an example of that. These were interviews with folks from Indiana, and sat in an archive and then was published just a few years ago. The title of the book, Homeless, Friendless, and Penniless, comes from one of the interviewees said that when we came to Indiana, we were homeless, friendless, and penniless. And it just it's a phrase that resonated so much with me. I also write songs, and I wrote a song based on the title of this book. Also have, this is a great piece of history, Democratic Party internal politics. These date from 1964. Fannie Lou Hamer and Victoria Gray were both part of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. As a 9-year-old, I remember watching the Democratic Convention, and there was this very prominent dispute about the seating of the Mississippi delegation. It had a segregationist, all-white delegation, and the Mississippi Freedom Party were African Americans and progressive whites who were challenging that, and there was a big floor fight over that. Ultimately, the segregationist folks were seated. But that fall, as I understand things, folks from the Freedom Party ran a shadow campaign. They weren't officially on the ballot, but they ran and encouraged people to write them in as a way to show that there was support for how they were trying to open up the voting process. And let's see, I love music, and music is a really big part of the civil rights movement. So I brought along a couple books. This is a great book, Pete Seeger and Bob Reiser, Everybody Says Freedom, A History of Civil Rights Through Song and Pictures. And Pete and Bob also did a book called Carry It On, which is a similar history using song and pictures. In that case, it's a history of the U.S. labor movement. Brought along some CDs, some which are a little bit vintage. This from the 60s. Some great collections of songs from the civil rights movement. Fannie Lou Hamer, who we mentioned earlier, this is a album of her recordings. But on the present day, there's still people singing freedom songs. Rhiannon Giddens is really well-regarded Americana artist, and if I'm remembering correctly, this is up for a Grammy this year. Freedom Highway, it's a great CD. Music also, I collect People's Songs. Newsletters. People's Songs was a organization formed by Pete Seeger after World War II to use music, primarily folk music, to cause political action, use it for labor organizing and civil rights organizing campaigns. So this is an example of one of their issues with Paul Robeson on there. The final couple of things regarding music, we have again another book of civil rights songs. This is from the day. Oak Publications was published a lot of books on the folk music and activist music movement. So this is a book showing some of their songs. This also looks similar if you've ever seen Sing Out magazine. That kind of style of where they give some songs and give some background about the songs. Similar thing, Jerry Silverman is someone who's produced lots of instructional books and other books about music, and he has this themed book of songs of protest and civil rights, which is a great introduction, simple arrangements, but to introduce people to some really good music about the civil rights movement. I think one of the nicer items that I was able to bring along today, a book, Martin Luther King produced this, telling the story of the Montgomery bus boycott. It's in pretty good condition, and this has just a really happy to have found that. Can you pause for, one area of my collection that I'm most proud of is things related to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. They're known as the Pullman Porters. They provided customer service to people taking cross-country trips for decades, and they're just really a fascinating piece of American history in terms of not only the story behind the people and how Pullman Porters were such a significant part in the development of the African-American middle class, but also in terms of their labor union activism. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters is considered one of the first major African-American unions. They were their leader was A. Philip Randolph, who has a fascinating history of his own, even prior to becoming involved with organizing the Pullman Porters. He was a giant in the American labor movement and in the civil rights movement. And as we've been showing the display to folks today, I've asked folks, who do you think of when you think of the March on Washington in 1963? And as most people would say, they say Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What many people don't know is that A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin were the two principal organizers of that event. In 1963, Randolph was an elder statesman of the civil rights movement. For decades, from the mid-30s until the 60s, Randolph and the Sleeping Car Porters provided a lot of resources for the emerging civil rights movement. And it's been really gratifying to come across the impact that he had. One button that is pretty obscure, when people think of the March on Washington, they think of the 1963 march. But Randolph was also involved during World War II in trying to push the federal government to expand job opportunities in the defense industry to African Americans. And to do that, he was organizing a March on Washington, and the march never actually happened because FDR signed an executive order to bring about some employment for African Americans in the defense industry. But that story of that march sort of, in some ways, set the stage for the 1963 march. This is an excellent book that tells the whole history of how those two events are related. And maybe as a final thing, we just have a button. I also collect Henry Wallace. This was a famous Henry Wallace button from 1948. The silhouette is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Wallace was running on the Progressive Party to try to keep alive the spirit of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. And right next to that, we see when President Obama ran, they used a similar photo tying Obama to the FDR and the New Deal legacy.
Carl Fisher, APIC member from Oregon, chapter coordinator, and my portion of the display today was about African American candidates from the Democratic Party, and specifically those from Oregon, right here in this frame. Variety of candidates. Charles Jordan was the first African American to be a commissioner on the Portland City Council. You've got Jim Hill, who was the first African American ever elected to statewide office in Oregon. You have some buttons representing Bill and Gladys McCoy's campaigns for public office. Bill McCoy was the first African American elected to the Oregon legislature. And Gladys was I believe, the first black person elected to public office in Oregon. And she was on the school board, she was on the county commission. I think she tried to run for city council at one time. But there's candidates from Glendora Claybrooks, who's run for county commissioner. There's Margaret Carter and Cameron Whitten and Lou Frederick, all from Oregon. And we come down a little bit further and we've got more nationally known candidates like Jesse Jackson, who ran here in 1984 and 1988. There's a lot of Oregon Jackson items in these frames because that's primarily what I collect is Oregon political items. And then we have another frame of African American candidates who ran at the national stage, from Shirley Chisholm and Doug Wilder, Carol Mosley Braun, and then we also have a Keith Ellenson for DNC pin, and then two little fun pins, Dick Gregory for president, not Democrats, but still pretty cool to have. And then finally we have a frame of Oregon Barack Obama items, as Barack Obama campaigned here for 2 primaries and then won 2 general elections. And that was my contribution to the exhibit today.